Well, a special thanks to all of you to come in from the sunshine. It's a real sacrifice to come in here. The good things about the later evenings are the sun will still be shining when you go in. That's how optimistic we've become in Scotland these days. I'm here, I think I qualify on two grounds. One is, described as a lion tamer. I've never been described that way before. I ask questions for a living as a business and economy editor at BBC Scotland. I think my other qualification is that Gerry didn't have to go very far to find me, to ask him questions, because I'm his next door neighbour along this way. As it happens, we've known each other rather longer than nearly 3 years since we moved in there. In that we've written a book together, and it's probably about 10 years ago. I always struggle to remember the name of it. I think it was the Modern Guide to Political Scotland.
Try again.
The Scottish Guide to Modern Politics.
Who's still wrong?
Was it the Political Guide to Scottish Modernism?
You're nearly right.
Something like that. What
Political Guide to Modern Scotland. A great title.
10 years and still can't remember that. For me, this was a very big deal, because it's the only book I've co-written, or written anyway at all. I tend to do with slightly shorter article type things. For Gerry, it was one of what is now, as of the past few days, weeks, very recently, number 19 book that he has co-written or edited. This one is different though, because this is the first book that he's written entirely on his own, without collaborators, people like me, and chapters being contributed, or part of a project that he's working on. So it's the most personal book of all. It's also extremely timely to be publishing a book like this, for obvious reasons. This taps straight into the kind of debate that's happening all over Scotland at the moment. I think it's useful, for sure. It's also a very important contribution, I think, to that debate. At a time when people are looking to possible futures for Scotland, this is really what Gerry's addressing. And it's also a particularly healthy contribution, I think, because the debate, partly this may be the media's fault, is this a binary choice between yes and no. And what Gerry is saying is it's so much more complex than that. We're coming from our history, and there's a whole lot more context to the choices that we're making. And simply to choose yes or no on the 18th of September is only one staging post to a number of different choices we have in future. And indeed the choice, whether it's yes or no, choice maybe not to change things very much at all. Gerry, I think it's fair to say, is rather more on the let's challenge that, let's change that. This is an opportunity, whichever side you're on, to move things on, to challenge the way things have been. It is probably ridiculous for me to continue in this vein, and Gerry is actually sitting here. so I'm going to get him to explain it rather more. But I'm going to ask, first of all, Gerry, I mean, as I say, it's a sort of binary divide, yes and no. And you've always seemed to me to be somebody who deliberately defies being pigeonholed, which is a good, healthy thing. How would you define yourself? Where your starting point for writing a book like this?
Well, you didn't give me forewarning of that question, and I did think, crikey, you know, it's such a big question. Right, I first of all define myself from where I come from, and I mean by that I'm talking politically and sort of values. So I always, and I'm going to use this really when I say always, I mean in the past tense in a sense. I've always defined myself as being on the left. I always defined myself as a left-winger. I always thought the left was the future of humanity and the planet, etc. Well, because I'm a natural contrarian, being critical, even much more critical of the tradition you were part of, because you demanded higher standards of your own tradition. It wasn't just good enough to be better than your opponents. And I defined myself from the mid-80s, poll tax, etc. I didn't realise I was Scottish in a political sense until the poll tax. I then defined myself as nationalist with a small n. But I always saw myself questioning both these traditions. And so eventually I came to the realisation that these are kind of political tribes. And for thinking about how to tackle some of the big issues, they are useful as anchors and park compasses, but they're also limiting. So really in a way, and without sounding like something out of Private Eye's Suits Call, you know, something, which is probably where I'm going straight into, is that I don't think of myself as a left-winger now. I called myself a nationalist until 2011, and I suddenly realised, oh, the limits of this were as important as the qualities of it, and so I count myself defined by those, but in the kind of morass of kind of like trying to, again, I try never to use terms like postmodernism ever, but
you're tempted to, aren't you?
No, I'm not. I've read enough philosophers who are even more pseudo-ish, and so I think some of the big questions about modernity and progress is kind of where I am, and influenced by those two traditions. And those two traditions have an awful lot to offer. I'm not trying to dismiss them, but I just think they don't have all the answers. I was particularly worried by, I mean, I don't know if people can concede this that still think themselves left, but I was particularly fed up of talking about a universalist language of the world, and yet posing the we that we talk about in left-wing talk as being like a little bit of humanity. I think the big questions are kind of like really about all of us and not about a wee version of we, so to speak.
So you become more internationalist and nationalist at the same time, and you define both of those pigeonholes.
Yeah, something like that.
Right. Let me ask you a bit about not just where you came from politically, but where you came from geographically, if you want. Dundee. And it's interesting that quite early on in this book, you set out to, not to tell your whole story, it's not a biography, but bits of it that are relevant to the arguments that you're trying to make. Now, what are those bits? Why does it matter where you're coming from, your Dundee past?
Well, I thought, firstly, that there's a propensity in large parts of public life, and I don't know if Scotland's worse or better than everywhere else on this, but just to like sound forth and say, you know, I am an authority, you know, I've been reading books for, you know, since I was, you know, too young, and speaking to people and thinking about these issues, and you just think, people present themselves, you know, the John Curtises, all these people in public, I am an authority, and people always become an authority through a set of subjective reasons. So I thought, go back to that. Even the fact I'm from Dundee, and I've lived in Glasgow 22 years, is kind of relevant to my view of the world, because I always grew up regarding Glasgow and Edinburgh as somewhere else. We grew up watching, you know, I grew up watching Grampian television, and then my parents worked out how to, this is a true story, put the TV aerial around the corner of their flat so we could get STV, and we could get the better quality film. So that gives you a different sense of Scotland. You grow up with Grampian, the continuity announcers, you know, it's not, I'm not saying STV was, even as a kid, it was just cosmopolitan view of the world. So that matters.
Think about you
I had lots of things my parents found kind of revolting, because they regarded that as a, well, my parents grew up, kind of to summarise it very quickly, they grew up regarding most things, this is the 70s, most things Scottish as an embarrassment. They believed that the future was going to get better, the future was going to get better for them, and the future was going to get better for people like me, their kids, and other people's kids, that you were going to have more educational opportunity, or more secure employment, and with all that, and I don't think it's very unusual, they believed in Britain. They believed Britain was the way to provide that. And so they saw Scotland as kind of relic of the past and all that. And things like, you know, the Hogmanay teleprograms and all that, they regarded as kind of like manifestations of all that, just embarrassments. And they subsequently, well, my mum sort of clung on to her British nationalism, to be honest, and my dad flipped into like being, going from being, my dad was a communist, and then he flipped to being a Scottish nationalist, which again is not a completely, you know, unusual story.
There's a temptation at this point for us to head down the road of nostalgia for memories of 1970s television programmes. Both of us have just had a very significant birthday. So it's tempting to relive the 70s a little bit, was our point of view, but we're not going to. Tell us an upsum, if you will, the thesis that you've set out in this book.
Right, I said try and get some 3 points, didn't I?
We'll give you 4 if you want.
Yeah, well, firstly, you see, in the point you make about yes, no, not being the sole thing, to me, this debate comes because Scotland is already significantly changing. It's become a less deferential society, it's become less ordered and controlling in the way, if you think, we go back many, a couple of centuries, the Church of Scotland was this power and force in the land. And then we still have, you know, various elites, the law and education of points. I think all that is changing. The union, the assumption of the silent majority of Union Scotland, that's all weakening. Not necessarily saying we're sure where we're going. And that, and the crisis of some of Scotland's institutions, you know, like say RBS, Rangers, Catholic Church having all sorts of scandals, I think that's aids us to come into where we are today. This debate wouldn't have happened without this opening in Scottish public life. And I think you combine that with the multiple crises of Britain, which I talk about in the book. I mean, this is not a debate just about us. You know, so when Martin Kettle says last week in The Guardian, I don't know if people saw that, he says, if Scotland votes for independence, you know, violence is possible. You know, remember the 1921 Easter uprising. I think that isn't really about us. I think that's about them. And I don't even want to say us and them, but I mean, I think it's about English fears about Britain and what's happening, and particularly liberal fears. And I think all those crises that we can maybe go into a bit more, you know, about the economy, about the City of London, about the limited nature of British democracy, are influences on this debate. This is not just a nationalist moment. This is a debate about many, many influences. And I'm particularly keen, because I regard the Better Together campaign as being primarily a nationalist campaign, so we've got two nationalisms, is to get the terrain onto some of the non-nationalist terrain that lots of us want to be on. What kind of Scotland do we want to live in? That isn't really answered entirely in nationalism, either British or Scottish.
Indeed, the proposition from the Yes campaign for independence is clear, whatever you think of it, but it's very unclear what as you say, it's a nationalist proposition coming from Britain.
Yeah.
It's very unclear. Have they got anywhere close to defining that, do you think?
Got to define what?
To define what kind of, the argument they're making for a Britain, that they, I should explain the background to my question.
Yes.
Is a programme I made recently for Radio 4, looking at what unionism is all about. And actually the Scottish nationalists were the only people who really thought about what unionism was about. The unionists really struggled to define what they're unionist about and for.
Yeah, no, I think they're no near at all. In fact, they're further away. I mean, again, it might, you know, annoy some nationalists saying this, but I think there was once a very, very flexible, adaptive tradition of unionism in Scotland and Britain. And you can really see it evident, certainly up to Thatcher, certainly at least up to Heath. And this is really, you know, it's not just about Thatcherists, this is really in significant retreat. And lots of us who are trying to have this argument about independence and self-government, who don't want to think of ourselves as nationals, in some way, actually, some British compromise might be the ideal scenario of this, you know, whether it's federalism or some kind of independence and some kind of union or cooperation with the rest of the United Kingdom. The problem with that is, because I think that would have been possibly ideal, it's because some people, like, I'd say, examples would be Ian McWhirter and the writer David Torrance, they're constantly trying to, let's say, we're getting more federalists or so on. There is no sign or interest in the British political system of developing a federalist Britain, or even quasi-federalist Britain. So that's why we've ended up having this debate, which is kind of, you know, it's a Scottish debate, but it also touches on the wider crises of Britain. We're kind of leading, you know, debates that some people in London would have found, you know, they'd rather not have, or some people in Scotland would rather not have them as well.
Now, in your book, you're myth busting.
Yeah.
In quite a big way. You sent out a number of myths. Let's go through this. The myth of Scottish democracy, that we assume it's functioning, you're arguing really it's not particularly well. The myth of egalitarianism, we like to think we're all Jock Tamson's bairns, but we're far from equal across Scotland.
Yeah.
The myth of educational opportunity, access for all, but actually not real access to equal education for many. Holding power to account, much of Scotland is unaccountable, or unaccounted, you're arguing. The myth of social democracy, you're saying a middle class Scotland for the middle class. And an open Scotland myth, I think particularly you're talking about immigration. I want to ask you a bit about myths.
Yeah.
Aren't they, I mean, you raise all of these in order to demolish them, but aren't myths rooted in a certain amount of reality?
Yes.
And indeed, aren't they quite important stories to tell about ourselves?
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, I have written on myths quite a bit, because and I actually like the idea of myths. Myths are fundamental to human beings and to how we define ourselves, and they are stories. And crikey, these stories matter. And whether the, you know, the empirical evidence, like Scotland is not very egalitarian, we are nearly as unequal as you know as the rest of the UK, or as certainly England, the only difference being London being in England. And educational opportunity, you know, so there's lots of facts there. But these things still matter, because they tell us something about who we are, or maybe a bit more who we want to be. And so what I'm saying about the educational opportunity, the egalitarianism, etc., holding power to account, if this is who we want to be, let's take a good hard look at the fact we're nowhere near these things at the moment, and let's do something about it. Let's mobilise ourselves and say this is what we want to be. Now, one of the things I take from the referendum is there's two divisions going on, at least. There's one group who, I mean, as Bits of Civic Scotland says, also bits of the new left groups about, who say, let's just use those mythical stories to get us to a yes vote. And then there's other forces saying, some of the pretty newer forces saying, these myths are very important because of, you know, the educational apartheid, etc., the class divide. But I think that is one of the fundamental things. What do we do about these myths? Do we decide to actually challenge them and decide, yeah, this is actually who we want to be? Because it would have to involve an awful lot of action.
These are all myths you like, that you say we're not living up to, but is this the essence of where you think we should be heading? Here are our goals, the myths, the stories that we tell about ourselves, let's go and make them true.
Yeah, I kind of think so. I mean, they are myths, and they're powerful myths for a set of reasons, aren't there? There's a whole set of historical, cultural, relationship with England reasons, even Thatcherism, even though I try and qualify that, why these are so still powerful in 2014.
Okay, let's try it then, eh? You'll notice right here. Down the tartan Adam, sitting at the pier. When I heard the pull the circle, no, sit here. Sit here. No, it don't know. Sit here. No, it don't know. Sit here. Was Chief Inspector Runcie, enhancing his career. Prancing up and down the road like Yogi Bear. Sit here. No, it don't know. Sit here. No, it don't know. Lovely. He thought for help to Glasgow, they nearly turned his ear. Forgot the chairs and Celtic demonstrators here. Sit here. No, it don't know. Sit here. No, it don't know. He telephoned the soldiers, but didn't he make it clear? The soldiers sent down Andy Stewart to volunteer. No, but you'll know. Sit here. No, but you'll know. He radioed the White House, but all that he could hear was 2, 1, 0, and the set went clear. No, but you'll know. Sit here. No, but you'll know. Sit here. For Jock had at the Eastbourne and need of sailor shroud, and he met with Billy Graham on a wee white cloud. No, but you'll know. Sit here. No, but you'll know. Sit here. So you'll notice that the demonstrators get the last word.